Well, happy Monday. I'm back for a new week. Kay is watching Bernie's report on Gene Debs. Thinks it's very good. I'm sure it is. And Dolores says, hi all. Avromano and Dolores and Russ Goldman have joined, and Lana Dell is here. Lana's joined as well. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to just jump right to Stephanie's book. Oh, but first, Russ asked me, how was your Father's Day weekend? Well, I was still recovering from last week's virus. So I was a little hampered in terms of things to do, but Bonnie and I still managed to have a very good weekend ourselves. Uh, Certainly, yesterday was a very nice day, even though we did very common things like wash clothes and and we made a nice dinner. And we relaxed appropriately and had a very, very good time. So thank you. And how was yours, Russ? Hi, Steve. Nice to see you. Sandy. Hello, Sandy. Thank you for coming. So before I launch into part 5 on trade, which is also chapter 5, I'm going to point out that a couple of days ago, Stephanie's book made the New York Times bestseller list. It had been a bestseller, okay, at Amazon almost from the start. Yeah, I know, Russ, but I still wanted to ask you. I'm glad you enjoyed it with your father. I'm sure that was very good. So she made the New York Times bestseller list, which of course has special prestige attached to it. I noticed also today that on Amazon, she had reached the number one best-selling spot in economic theory, which is interesting because it's of course, a very commonsensical theory book. So Stephanie's book is really kicking it, which means probably that a lot of people are agreeing with me that it's a pretty good book, all in all. Yeah, Jamie Galbraith was more fulsome in his praise, of course. Jamie's been backing Stephanie for years now, and he continues to do it in a very valuable way. Marvel says, evening, beautiful people. Evening, Carmen. Okay, let's get back to the book. I will share So the name of chapter 5 of the book is Winning, quote unquote, at Trade, and winning is in scare quotes. I think that, okay, is actually very appropriate, because whether you're winning a trade or losing a trade will often depend upon what your objectives are and whether you're fulfilling those objectives in trade. Anyway, myth number 5, Stephanie says, is the trade deficit means America is losing. But she says the reality is America's trade deficit is its, quote, stuff, unquote, surplus. Hmm. Ah. And she starts off with a story about how her son Bradley and she were watching the Republican primary debates. Trump was thundering that we're losing the trade war against foreigners. And he said, we don't win anymore. We don't beat China in trade. We don't beat Japan in trade. With their millions and millions of cars coming into this country. And she points out this message resonated with millions of Americans, especially in states like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Wisconsin, where many voters traced the hollowing out of their communities and the loss of good paying jobs to import competition and rising trade deficits. And she points out that when he became the president, Trump remained obsessed with the gap between imports and exports. That is America's trade deficit with the rest of the world. She points out that from his point of view, the trade deficit is the prima facie evidence that our country, America, is losing at trade. And she points out that on the one hand, Trump sees the losses in monetary terms, tweeting, quote, the United States has been losing for many years $600 to $800 billion a year on trade. With China, we lose $500 billion. And then, sorry, we're not going to be doing that anymore, unquote. The problem, he seems to believe, is that foreigners are running off with our money. When he looks at the real terms of trade, the actual goods that are being traded between Americans and foreigners, he again sees America getting the raw end of the trade deal. In exchange for the millions of cars Japan is sending us, Trump explained in August 2019, we send them wheat. Wheat. That's not a good deal, unquote. Well, at that point, her son Bradley, then 13, turned to her and said, quote, so the problem is that we take their cars and they only take our wheat? And he says, that would be like me giving Ian 2 of my low-value trading cards and getting 10 of his high-value cards in exchange. He said, I would be very happy with that deal, unquote. Stephanie quoting her son. My guess is now 18. God, I can hardly believe he's 18. I recall meeting him at a conference here when it was either 2012 or 2013. So he was 11 then. He seemed even a little younger than that, but certainly precocious. Anyway, viewed from this perspective, you could say that a country wins by maximizing its benefits, the imports, and minimizing its costs, the exports. But that would imply counterintuitively that America's roughly $700 billion trade deficit is evidence that the United States is already winning at trade. Could this be right? Does Trump have it completely backward? Instead of using tariffs to wage a trade war aimed at reducing the volume of goods coming into the United States from China and elsewhere, should the U.S. be trying to run even bigger trade deficits? Would that make us the undisputed global trade champion? Question mark. As we'll see below, it's much more complicated than the simple black and white of winning and losing in trade. So why do many Americans feel like everyone is, quote, killing us, unquote, when it comes to trade? And then she says, in a word, jobs. And she points to a quote from Richard Trumka, who explained to Trump just 1 week before the inauguration, quote, entire communities have lost their purpose and identity, and we have to fix that, unquote. And Trump vowed to support Trump's commitment to renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement and other deals, saying, working people are looking for a new way forward on trade, quote unquote. Of course, when Trump actually made that particular deal, even though it was slightly better than the previous NAFTA deal, Trumka was unsatisfied with the protection it gave to workers and to the environment, as it happens. Just like many workers in America, millions of workers in China, Japan, and elsewhere depend on their jobs for their livelihoods. If demand for the things they help to produce suddenly dries up, their jobs would disappear. That's why we often hear politicians and unions urging consumers to buy American, or pressing companies like Ford or Apple to manufacture more of their products here in the United States. When Americans spend money buying things that are produced abroad, that demand supports jobs in other parts of the world instead of sustaining jobs here at home. Since 1994, when Clinton signed NAFTA, ushering in a new era of, quote, free trade, unquote, life has gotten steadily worse for millions of Americans. As industrial corporations have relocated their production centers to Mexico and eventually to countries beyond North America where they could pay workers even lower wages, millions of good-paying union jobs have disappeared. China's full accession into the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in 2001 wreaked similar havoc on the U.S. working class. Economists at the Economic Policy Institute conclude that China's demand for U.S. exports may have supported 538,000 American jobs from 2001 to 2011, but Chinese imports into the U.S. cost more than 3.2 million Americans their jobs, for a net loss of about 2.7 good-paying union jobs. On top of that, to the extent those displaced workers were able to find new employment, the new jobs paid an average of 22.6% less than what they were earning before. This kind of trade-driven displacement has gutted entire regions where manufacturing was the lifeblood of large numbers of communities. It has also forced great swaths of Americans into permanent involuntary unemployment or a sinister cycle of low-wage service jobs. Excuse me. And it came against a backdrop in which neighborhoods and towns were already profoundly disrupted a decade earlier by corporate farm consolidation. These communities would go on to be pummeled again during the following decade via the China-related WTO trade shocks. Years later, the Great Recession of 2008 would deal another lethal round of job losses. By the time Trump came to town in 2016, his fear-mongering about the migrants and scaremongering about the trade deficit found a receptive audience among workers already besieged by one economic calamity after another. Consequently, for many of these workers, there was seemingly nothing to lose by embracing Trump's call to arms. Win a trade, bring jobs home, and make America great again. Meanwhile, the Dems mounted a tone-deaf response. Hillary Clinton's campaign marketed blue baseball caps bearing the slogan, "America is already great." Anyway, Clinton didn't lay out a compelling plan to restore good-paying jobs and help struggling communities. Top Democrats simply gave up on many working-class voters. For example, Chuck Schumer argued, quote, "For every blue-collar Democrat we lose in Western Pennsylvania, we'll pick up 2 moderate Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and you can repeat that in Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin," unquote. It was a losing strategy for the Democratic Party, says Steph, and of course she was dead right about that. After winning the election in 2016, Trump's continued to stick with the message that the U.S. is locked in a losing competition when it comes to trade. Even some of his opponents echoed those sentiments. Senator Bernie Sanders, for example, tweeted, "It's wrong to pretend that China isn't one of our major economic competitors. Well, we are in the White House. We will win that competition by fixing our trade policies." Certainly, Sanders aimed and still aims to fix trade policy by protecting workers and the environment. Yet there is a tinge of anxiety that is shared by progressives with conservatives, fear of the trade deficit itself. The truth is, a trade deficit is not in and of itself something to fear. We don't need to zero out the trade deficit to protect jobs and rebuild communities. As long as the federal government stands ready to use its fiscal capacity to maintain full employment at home, there is no reason to resort to trade war. Instead, we can envision a new world trade order that works better, not for corporations seeking to exploit cheap labor and escape from regulations, but for millions of workers who have received such a raw deal under previous free trade policies in the post-NAFTA era. Re-envisioning trade can also lead to better policies for developing countries and for the global environment. Stephanie, therefore, seeking a win-win rather than a trade war. Then Stephanie gets into 3 buckets. One way to think about trade imbalances is to add a 3rd bucket to the model we used in the last chapter. The last chapter, you recall, the sector balances, 2 buckets, the government bucket and the non-government bucket. Now we're going to have 3 buckets. That is the non-government sector, has to be split up into two separate buckets, giving us a bucket that belongs to all U.S. households and businesses. That's the domestic private sector bucket, along with one that stands for the rest of the world, belongs to the rest of the world, i.e., the foreign sector bucket. Now remember that these buckets receive flows, of dollars, and they send flows of dollars to other buckets. So we're talking about three buckets and the flow of dollars among them back and forth. Steph points out, as before, it's impossible for all the buckets to be in surplus or deficit at the same time. If there's red ink in one bucket, there must be black ink in at least one other bucket. And she refers to when Godley again says, as Godley told me, quote, everything must come from somewhere and then go somewhere. For every payment that flows out of one bucket, a payment of equal size must be received into at least one other bucket. As a matter of accounting, that means that the balance across all three buckets must always sum to zero. Exhibit 8 captures these relations. And there is Exhibit 8, U.S. government financial balance, U.S. private sector financial balance, the foreign sector financial balance. And again, it's an accounting identity. So the flows of dollars have to be equal to zero. And Steph gives some examples. If the U.S. government buys some bulldozers from Caterpillar, and hire some American workers to build a bridge, dollars will flow into the U.S. private sector bucket as the government makes those payments. American workers and most U.S. businesses also pay federal taxes. So Uncle Sam subtracts some of those dollars away from the private sector bucket. To keep it simple, suppose as before that Uncle Sam spends $100 and taxes $90 away, leaving behind a surplus of $10 in the private sector bucket. Those dollars can spin around in the private sector, changing hands as Americans pay for haircuts, theater tickets, and college tuition. They can also switch buckets as Americans import products from abroad. So let's say Americans spend $5 buying goods and services from the rest of the world, while foreigners spend just $3 buying products from the United States. By importing more than its exports, the U.S. is running a trade deficit. When all is said and done, the U.S. trade deficit transfers $2 into the foreign sector bucket. Exhibit 9 nets all these payments out, showing that the U.S. government's fiscal deficit minus 10 is exactly balanced by the sum of the surpluses in the other two buckets. $8 in a domestic private sector bucket surplus and a $2 surplus in the foreign sector bucket. As long as the U.S. economy remains at full employment, there is no inherent problem with this outcome. There we see government deficit of minus 10 and private sector surplus of plus 8, a foreign sector surplus of plus 2. And by the way, that's what happened during the recovery period. Once the government passed the stimulus bill, in 2009. Then, of course, that stimulus bill and the deficit spending created a substantial deficit by the U.S. government sector. But that meant that the private sector quickly had a surplus in that year. During the fiscal year in 2009 and again in 2010 and going forward, the private sector in the U.S. had a surplus. And its surplus was substantial as the recovery proceeded. The foreign sector also had a surplus because we ran a trade deficit. But during the recession, that trade deficit grew far smaller than it had been. It had risen to as high as 6% of GDP. Over the period of the recovery, it shrank back down to 2% of GDP, while the U.S. private sector surplus grew. But in all those years, the U.S. government continued to run a deficit. And in doing that, it was supporting both the private sector surplus and the foreign sector surplus. Steph points out, since Uncle Sam is the issuer of the dollar, he never has to worry about running low. His bucket can manufacture dollars at will, but everyone else has to get the currency from somewhere. And the U.S. private sector wants to accumulate more dollars than it spends. That's not to say that the private sector can't fall into deficits. It can, as it did during the late 1990s and early 2000s. But as Godly warned, that's usually an unsustainable situation because it often involves the private sector taking on too much debt. Remember, the private sector isn't a currency issuer. So it can't sustain deficits the way Uncle Sam can. To keep the U.S. sector from falling into to keep the U.S. private sector from falling into deficit, someone needs to supply that bucket with enough dollars to keep it in surplus. Right now, that someone is Uncle Sam. That's because the U.S. runs persistent trade deficits, aka stuffed surpluses, which cause dollars to flow out of the private sector's bucket and into the foreign bucket. As long as that remains the case, only Uncle Sam can supply enough dollars to keep the private sector in surplus. Okay, to do that, the government must run budget deficits that exceed the U.S. trade deficit. Exhibit 10 shows what happens if the government deficit becomes smaller than a trade deficit. There's a situation where the government deficit was minus $1. But the foreign sector surplus was $2. But the private sector in the U.S. sent $5 to the foreign sector, but only got back $3 from the foreign sector. That left the U.S. private sector with a deficit, of $1 in this example. You can see the private sector deficit of $1 and the government deficit of $1 equals the foreign sector surplus of $2. Now, if I recall correctly, this actually happened in the final year of the Obama administration. Okay, Obama's deficit had fallen pretty far, and the private sector deficit with the foreign sector had gone back to something like 3 or 4%. And so the private sector, if I recall correctly, in the last year of the Obama administration was going into the red again. Why? Because Obama's deficits were too small. And they got smaller and smaller as he practiced fiscal responsibility. Steph says, in this example, the government has almost balanced its budget, but not quite. Uncle Sam is running a small deficit, spending 100 into the U.S. and taxing 99 back out. As a result, his deficit adds just 1 to the private sector, but the U.S. is sending that dollar and 4 more onto the rest of the world, and foreigners are only sending $3 back. So the U.S. is running a trade deficit, spending $5 on goods and services produced by the rest of the world, but only collecting $3 for the things it sells abroad. So the foreign sector gets a $2 surplus, and the government and the private sector each end up with a $1 deficit. And Steph summarizes by saying the private sector deficit is the inevitable consequence of allowing the government deficit to fall below the trade deficit. So keep that in mind. The two deficits are linked. If that trade deficit hits a particular mark, the government deficit has to be larger if the private sector is to have a surplus. Sorry. And then she goes through different ways to eliminate the deficit of the private sector, and points to Trump lashing out at China, accusing the Chinese government of playing around, of manipulating its currency, the yuan, to gain an advantage over our producers. In December 2019, he accused the Argentinians and the Brazilians of presiding over a massive devaluation of their currencies, which is not good for our farmers, he said. Some countries don't have the option to weaken their currencies. 19 countries in Europe, for example, have formed a currency union, making it impossible to alter the value of their currencies vis-a-vis one another. And she points out €1 equals €1 throughout the Eurozone. When an external currency devaluation isn't an option, countries often pursue internal devaluation as a way to try to win, quote unquote, at trade. The neoliberal term of art for this particular strategy is structural reform. It's the polite way of describing an agenda aimed at driving down labor costs, wages and pensions to increase competitiveness by reducing the costs of production. Essentially, it means that a country uses weaker labor as a substitute for a weaker currency. When it comes to this strategy, Germany is the poster child of Europe. After the German government committed to this strategy in the early 2000s, it was able to replace its long-standing trade deficits with massive trade surpluses. The thinking behind Trump's policy was to use tariffs, taxes on imports, to reduce the U.S. trade deficit. by making certain foreign goods more expensive. Trump thinks he's pursuing an America First strategy that will result in American consumers buying fewer imports and spending more money buying domestically produced goods. That would mean fewer dollars leaving the U.S. private sector bucket and flowing into the foreign bucket. Trump sees that as winning because his entire worldview is shaped by cash flows. The one with the biggest bucket of money wins. MMT recognizes the importance of maintaining healthy financial balances, but views the tariffs as largely counterproductive. That's because Trump recognizes that that's because MMT recognizes that imports are real benefits. Viewed this way, Trump's tariffs are really a tax on U.S. benefits. There are better ways to maintain a healthy balance in the private sector, and as we'll see, better ways to protect American jobs. Stephanie's next section is called No Full Employment, No Fair Trade. She says, now that we understand the simple financial flows, we can return to thinking about human and economic impacts of trade. And she points out again that we often don't just lose dollars to the rest of the world. We lose jobs too. She opines most of the angst people feel when they think about our trade deficits appears to stem from pain, especially the pain that comes from unemployment, as American businesses close up shop and ship jobs overseas. As MMT economist, Pavlina Cherneva has documented unemployment resembles an epidemic, like a virus. It affects other people nearby, resulting not only in lost income, but higher mortality and suicide rates, and a permanent decline in well-being. But it's easier to blame immigrant workers, foreign currency manipulators, or even global technology than to come to terms with the fact that joblessness is an official policy in the United States. Stephanie says, I have argued that one of the best answers to they took our jobs is everyone gets a job. Unquote. The MMT solution to involuntary unemployment is to introduce a federal job guarantee. That establishes a legal right to a good job at good wages with good benefits. This would address one of the most pernicious effects stemming from trade, the unemployment that is too often visited upon whole communities as jobs are lost to foreign competition. It's not enough just to provide training and other temporary forms of assistance to workers whose jobs are lost to foreign competition. Federal programs like trade adjustment assistance are important, but something more is needed. That something is a federal job guarantee. By no means is it a panacea, but at a minimum, it begins to tackle the problem of unemployment directly, as opposed to subsidizing the effects of unemployment. Through the thick and thin of the business cycle, we leave tens of millions of Americans idle in the belief that this makes political, economic, and social sense. Consider the closure of the Harley-Davidson manufacturing facility in Kansas City, Missouri, the city in which I taught for 17 years. The company's 800 workers were left stunned by the announcement that ultimately resulted in a net loss of 350 jobs. And the timing was particularly pernicious, coming as it did against the backdrop of a dividend increase for shareholders and an announcement that the company would spend millions buying back up to 15 million shares of its own stock. Had a federal job guarantee program been in place, it would have mitigated the impact of the closure. At a minimum, it would have provided the workers whose jobs were lost with a way to remain employed right in their communities. But it would have done more than that. The benefits of a federal job guarantee not only include the production of goods, services, and income. The guarantee also features on-the-job training and skill development, poverty alleviation, community building and social networking, social, political, and economic stability, and social multipliers. These are positive feedback loops and reinforcing dynamics that create a virtuous cycle of socioeconomic types benefits. With a program like this in place, the government would have mitigated the localized devastation of communities that directly experience the loss of well-paying industrial jobs. It may be hard to imagine an economy that doesn't allow millions to fall by the wayside, but that's because America has almost never achieved anything like true full employment. It's something we've rarely experienced outside of wartime. One of the most important features of a job guarantee program is that it maintains a form of full employment by immediately rehiring the unemployed into public service work, providing them with income and retraining required when they're displaced by trade shocks. In this way, the job guarantee can serve as the core of a response to both, quote, free trade, unquote, and the, quote, trade war, unquote. With the job guarantee, free trade is no longer a threat to full employment, and trade wars are no longer necessary to prevent unemployment. So then our trading negotiations can then focus on labor standards and environmental sustainability, with the U.S. using its market power to promote acceptable working conditions and environmental standards worldwide. Today, Chinese firms sell American households many environmentally unfriendly products. In addition, people all over the world currently endure unsafe and unsanitary conditions in order to provide America its stuffed surplus. If we want to prioritize the well-being of workers worldwide, communities, and the planet as a whole, then we need a new approach to global trade. This is the winning approach that Stephanie is trying to commit us to, especially in an era of global climate crisis. We should not be suckered by the simplistic rhetoric of countries winning, quote unquote, and losing at trade. Absolutely. Trump's view is very simplistic, and he's got us thinking simplistically. The quality of trade, says Stephanie, is at least as important as the quantity of trade. What ends and whose interests are our trade relationships serving? Just like with fiscal policy, the big scary number that is the trade deficit is not worthy of so much attention. As MMT reminds us, real resources, real social needs, and real environmental benefits are what matters most when it comes to trade policy. At this point, it is important to understand a bit more about our trading partners around the world and the United States' special privileges compared to other countries. So far, we've discussed how global trade affects the United States and how MMT can make the trade flows into and out of our own country more productive and humane. But what about Britain, France, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Venezuela, and all the other nations out there? And then Steph goes into the special position of the U.S. dollar. And she goes into the history somewhat, how there's been a fundamental shift in the way our monetary system operates since the 1970s. And she thinks this shift has redefined how we think about macroeconomics and the role of a national government that issues its own currency. He says, unfortunately, on the question of trade, as in so many other matters, policymakers remain locked in an anachronistic framework that belongs to the bygone gold standard era. And she brings up the gold standard, the Nixon gold shock of the early 1970s. And she points out that although the framework's restrictions, that is the gold standard framework, will gradually loosen, the overriding principle remained the same in all countries. The monetary authority effectively tethered the value of its currency to gold by standing ready to buy or sell gold or US dollars to meet any supply or demand imbalance that arose from international trade. To carry out these interventions, the central bank or equivalent in those days had to maintain enough gold or US dollars to back the circulating currency at a fixed exchange rate. A gold standard is only credible if the government can make good on its promise to convert the currency into gold at a fixed price. Having enough gold was critical. Stephanie points out the gold standard system was suspended during World War I and World War II because the U.S. and other nations needed to expand their policy space by running large deficits. And they weren't able to be on the gold standard, at that time. Steph points out if we still had this kind of system today, then Donald Trump's desire to wipe out the U.S. trade deficit would make far more sense. After World War II, a new international monetary system was born. That is the Bretton Woods framework. It called for the U.S. dollar to be pegged to gold. Moreover, all other currencies in the system were then pegged to the value we set for our dollar. The exchange rate at the time that was applied at the time set the price of gold at $35 per ounce. In effect, Bretton Woods recreated the gold standard, one step removed, with the U.S. dollar now providing the central link in the monetary chain. Governments could now sell gold to the United States Treasury at the price of $35 per ounce, and the U.S. Treasury had to honor the terms of the exchange. In 1971, other countries became concerned that the U.S. gold holdings were no longer adequate to cover the number of dollars in circulation at the fixed exchange rate. To stem pressures on the dollar, President Nixon shocked the world by declaring a temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. Then a second shock followed in 1973 when Nixon announced that he was making the temporary suspension permanent. His move was brought about by the realization that the U.S. needed more policy space than was available under Bretton Woods. And Nixon declared, quote, "We must create more and better jobs. We must stop the rise in the cost of living. We must protect the dollar from the attacks of international money speculators." When he announced the change in policy, Nixon declared, quote, "We must create more and better jobs. We must stop the rise in the cost of living. We must protect the dollar from the attacks of international money speculators." To achieve the first two goals, he proposed tax cuts and a 90-day freeze on prices and wages. To achieve the third, he directed the suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. Well, there was a big reaction. A lot of social instability throughout the world, causing the Bretton Woods system to collapse. It had been under pressure in the 1960s because there'd been a series of competitive devaluations of currencies relative to other currencies. And from this point on, most major currencies were no longer on the gold standard. They ended it. They were no longer on a fixed exchange rate. Instead, they allowed their exchange rates to float, or those with sovereign currencies did anyway. When they abandoned fixed exchange rates and floating their currencies gave currency issuing governments like the US expanded policy space to sustain full employment. But in spite of this happening, in spite of the abandonment of fixed exchange rates and Bretton Woods, gold standard thinking still dominates our discourse on trade policy, which is why so many politicians still regard trade deficits as inherently dangerous. Steph points out, on a gold standard, the government can run out of gold. With the end of the gold standard and off fixed global exchange rates, this kind of thinking is no longer valid. The only residual legacy left from Bretton Woods is that the US dollar still plays a central role in the global economy. When companies and governments around the world engage in trade with one another, they write an enormous portion of those contracts in US dollars. Even when the country doing the buying and the country doing the selling don't use dollars as their internal domestic currency. A handful of other currencies, like the euro, play a role like this, but none come close to dominating markets the way the US dollar does. Nearly 90% of currency trading involves the US dollar. This is the situation people are referring to when they say the US dollar is the dominant global currency. Could that change? Yes, of course. Nothing lasts forever. As MMT economist L. Randall Wray put it, quote, "The dollar will not always reign supreme, but it has a lot of life remaining as the most desirable asset to hold in portfolios." And then Stephanie introduces the key idea of the spectrum, of monetary sovereignty. She points out that the idea, of monetary sovereignty is not really a dichotomous idea. There are degrees, of monetary sovereignty. And she goes on to give examples, explaining that here. In addition to the United States, countries like the UK, Japan, Canada, and Australia, to name a few, enjoy a high degree of monetary sovereignty. They all issue non-convertible fiat currencies, and they largely refrain from borrowing in currencies that are not their own. And of course, they float the value of their currencies on international currency exchanges. Generally speaking, countries that fit this set of criteria will have greater monetary sovereignty and thus more policy autonomy when it comes to managing their own economic destinies. They needn't agonize over government deficits or trade deficits, and they're free to focus their domestic policy agenda on achieving macroeconomic goals like full employment and price stability. Now, there is something really interesting. Stephanie postulates here there are macroeconomic goals like full employment and price stability. Now, those were the explicit goals stated by the Center for Full Employment and Price Stability that existed at the University of the UMKC while she was there. That is to say, the center made explicit that it wanted to maximize those two goals. Stephanie seems to be subscribing to them to some degree here. Now, that's not always the case, okay, in MMT literature. Sometimes MMT writers seem to be subscribing to the goal of favoring policies that fulfill the abstract standard of the public purpose. But some, of course, will say that from an economic standpoint, the public purpose is achieving full employment and price stability so that there's a connection between these two things. But Stephanie is careful in this book not to be too direct about subscribing to goals. But I thought, Kay, I ought to point out that she mentions these two goals here. Some nations have weakened their monetary sovereignty, either by pegging their exchange rates, points to Bermuda, Venezuela, Niger, and says by doing this, they're abandoning, and second, there were other countries that abandoned their national currencies, all 19 currencies in the Eurozone, Ecuador and Panama, or by borrowing heavily in US dollars or other foreign countries. Examples of the Ukraine, Argentina, Turkey, and Brazil. And she points out doing any of these things compromises a nation's monetary sovereignty and diminishes its policy flexibility. She points out most of the developing economies are at the weaker end of the sovereignty spectrum. Even those that can issue a non-convertible fiat currency usually can't afford to ignore fiscal and trade imbalances. That's because most poorer developing nations rely on imports to meet vital social needs like food, oil, medicines, technologies. And that means they have to worry about how they're going to get enough foreign currency, usually US dollars, to pay for imports. Many end up borrowing in US dollars and then struggling to repay those loans. For these and other reasons, many countries around the world are stuck in a situation where they can't rely on their own currency issuing powers to build a good economy for all their people. The developing countries may receive aid from the international community or loans from institutions like the IMF, but it never seems to be enough to help them escape the trap of needing to rely on foreign currency for their survival. Now remember, that's what happened to Weimar in the period between the two wars. And by running trade deficits The U.S. allows these countries to build up their U.S. dollar reserves. Those dollars are a lifeline to the food, to medicines, and other critical imports that many developing countries depend on for survival. They also help um, indebted nations earn the currency they need to repay loans to the IMF and other foreign lenders. In a very important sense, our trade deficits are not optional. Much of the world simply must run trade surpluses with America if we want those countries to survive, which generally we do, she might have added. Even developed countries, e.g., Korea, Taiwan, Japan, end up stockpiling US dollars. These dollars are usually held in the form of US treasuries. That is, they're the yellow dollars that Stephanie pointed to earlier in the book. When foreign countries run trade surpluses with the U.S. pours dollars into the foreign bucket. Just like anyone else with green dollars, foreigners can then recycle them into the yellow dollars we call U.S. treasuries. That makes some people nervous as they interpret it as a sign of weakness on the part of the U.S. To them, it looks like the U.S. is dependent on foreign lenders to pay its bills. Remember when Obama said that the U.S. had taken out, quote, a credit card from the Bank of China, unquote. But that's not what's really happening. In fact, if you look closely at the major international holders of U.S. treasuries, you discover that nearly all of them are net exporters to the United States, including China, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the world's major crude oil producers. It is true that the U.S. government pays interest on those yellow dollars, but as we have learned, bond sales are always optional in a country like the United States. Giving foreigners access to treasuries simply grants them the same option available to any holder of green dollars. The rest of the world likes this. For the same reason you and I might like having the option to hold some of our money in a checking account and some of it in a savings account. The point is, we are not dependent on foreigners in the way many fear. In short, just as Uncle Sam's budget deficit arises from American business and households' desires to accumulate a surplus of US dollars, our trade deficit arises from the rest of the world's desire to accumulate a surplus of US currency. The global hunger for dollars is largely why we've been running a trade deficit nonstop for decades. In this regard, the United States does sit in a powerful position compared to the rest of the world. For both good and ill. Thanks to the U.S. dollar's unique role as a global reserve currency, Uncle Sam never has to borrow in anything but his own currency, and he doesn't even have to do that. Gives the U.S. something of an advantage, but it does not mean that we're the only country with the power to carry out a domestic policy agenda. Any country with a high degree of monetary sovereignty has the ability to pursue a domestic policy agenda aimed at keeping its economy operating at full employment. As we'll see, even developing countries can enhance their monetary sovereignty and open up enough policy space to allow them to pursue domestic full employment. Many advanced economies enjoy a high degree of monetary sovereignty. They have many value-added production sectors, a point we'll return to below. They boast enormous opportunities for those eager to invest in their economies, buying stock, real estate, and more. Since investing in those domestic assets means obtaining the country's respective currencies, demand for their currencies remains high across the globe. In economic jargon, they have deep capital markets. Just as MMT argues that domestic demand for the US dollar is driven by the need to pay federal taxes, and this demand supports the dollar's value. The international need for investment assets drives demand for both the US dollar and other major currencies, helping to stabilize their value. Like the US, these other advanced nations float their currencies, meaning they don't try to tie the value of the currency to anything else. That way, they don't have to defend the peg by buying, selling, or borrowing currencies they don't control. This is another reason they enjoy very high degrees of monetary sovereignty. Now, there are many countries that weaken their monetary sovereignty by continuing to peg their currencies to the US dollar. Saudi, Lebanon, and Jordan, or use the dollar as their official domestic currency. Ecuador, Panama, and El Salvador. In both of these cases, making a much bigger effort to accumulate and stockpile dollars becomes a necessity. Pegging your currency can also worsen your monetary sovereignty over time as your private sector grows increasingly accustomed to borrowing in the currency you're pegging to. Meanwhile, governments themselves may have to get deeper and deeper into US dollar debt, which reduces their monetary sovereignty even further. Further down the spectrum, another choice that strips countries of monetary sovereignty is joining a currency union. Nations like France, Spain, and Italy, despite being advanced economies with deep capital markets, cannot operate as currency issuers. That's because they're all members of the Eurozone, using a currency that can only be issued by the European Central Bank. That relegates all Eurozone members to mere currency users. This point is crucial to understanding Greece's seemingly endless debt crises. For example, Greece put itself in a situation where it could only get the currency it needed from the European Central Bank. It could not free its own banking system from the European Central Bank. So even when it wanted to extricate itself from the Eurozone, it found that very, very difficult to do, even to the point where its membership in the Eurozone has been undermining democracy in Greece. And I wrote a whole book about that. Fascinating. It was fascinating the way that the European Central Bank had acquired operational control over the Greek banking system to such an extent that its banking system would have sustained severe damage without making very, very important technical changes that it evidently didn't have the expertise to put forward when it was trying to improve its own situation in 2015. Finally, at the opposite end of the monetary sovereignty spectrum from the US are the poor developing countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. We should close out this chapter by discussing their situation in some detail, because despite the damage done by trade policy to the American working class, the United States is far from the most abused victim of the modern international trade order. And then the next section, cutely titled, Out of the Bretton Woods into the Free Trade Fire. She points out that mostly developing countries don't have the diverse and mature industries that advanced developed countries do. In fact, this is basically the definition of a developing country. Countries such as Bangladesh, Vietnam, or Ghana generally have to provide the rest of the world with cheap labor or natural resources like oil, metals, or minerals, and those export industries tend to dominate their economies. To get high-tech and high-value items like computers, cars, medicine, or robotics, developing countries have to import them from economies that are more developed. There are many developing countries that also lack the ability, or have been told they don't have the ability, to produce enough food, energy, and medicine to meet their own domestic demand. So they rely on developed countries to supply them with imports of food, energy, and medicine. And as we've discussed, they almost always need US dollars to pay for those crucial imports. As MMT economist Fadl Kaboub has argued, this position at the bottom of global supply chains brings fundamental economic problems. Quite a few of them arising from the historical legacy of colonization itself. And there's a reference there to an article by Scott Ferguson, Maximilian Sayo, and William Sass. So that's an online discussion with Fadl Kaboub on July 7th, 2018, that explains the situation. Exporting cheap labor and commodities while importing expensive, high-value items tends to leave developing countries with perpetual trade deficits. The problem is there isn't a robust permanent appetite for developing countries' financial assets or real estate. Economists say they lack deep capital markets, while investors will speculate in emerging markets buying financial assets denominated in the developing country's local currency. They don't make the kinds of long-term investments that would allow developing countries to gain durable access to currencies like the US dollar. As long as the rest of the world refuses to accept the currencies of developing countries in payment for critical imports, developing nations will be forced to borrow US dollars and other foreign currencies they don't control. Not only does this undermine their monetary sovereignty, it can leave developing nations mired in a cycle whereby they sell domestic currency to get the foreign currency they need, driving down the value of the domestic currency and making these critical imports more expensive, which can easily lead to import-led inflation and even political turmoil, as we've seen in Venezuela, Argentina, and in Professor Kaboub's native but Tunisia. And also, as we saw, in Weimar, in the interwar period, the inflation there was led by the need for foreign currency and to use a steadily declining value of the domestic currency to buy the foreign currency or the gold that was needed by Weimar to pay the war debts. And this led to import-led inflation and to political turmoil. There are more examples. Dollar-starved economies often experience a burst of investments from speculative Western investors who sweep into a country, feverishly investing in those economies, driving up the value of the local currency, only to get cold feet and suddenly pull their cash back out, causing the local currency to collapse. Or maybe global demand for a country's key exports suddenly collapses, leaving the country scrambling to earn enough foreign currency to finance its imports. That happened to Venezuela and Russia when the natural gas fracking boom in the U.S. drove oil prices sharply down. And it's what happened in Argentina when the price of soybeans collapsed, depriving the country of a critical source of U.S. dollars. In the case of both investor panic and market collapse, the bottom drops out of the developing country's currency, leading to inflation and upheaval. Stephanie goes on, she makes the point that, in fact, the U.S. dollar's role as the currency hegemon means the whole world is exposed to the United States' control over dollar interest rates. Decisions taken by the Federal Reserve can have profound consequences for developing currencies. And yet countries often have few ways to defend themselves. For example, beginning in 1979, former Federal Reserve Chair Paul Volcker initiated a series of substantial interest rate hikes, believing that this was the only way to tame the double-digit inflation that was roiling the U.S. economy. When that happened, Latin American countries that were indebted to the United States, sub-Saharan African countries indebted to former European colonizers, suddenly found themselves facing much higher borrowing costs. They were already exporting so many low-value added manufacturing goods that they were reliant upon those richer countries for more crucial imports. At the same time, rising interest rates in the U.S. raised the dollar exchange rate by stoking demand for U.S. investment assets. So this delivered a double gut punch to developing countries who not only saw the value of their currencies drop precipitously, but also faced borrowing costs on a growing pile of debt that was denominated in a foreign currency, specifically mostly in dollars. In the end, Volcker's rate hikes drove many developing countries into crisis, fueling a rapid economic downfall, from which some countries have yet to fully recover. Back when Bretton Woods was still in effect, the system established a host of international organizations. Within the Bretton Woods system, these organizations focused on actively governing the conditions of trade among countries. They involved a variety of tools like tariffs and capital controls aimed at keeping trade flows stable and national economies at least somewhat insulated from one another. But with the end of Bretton Woods, the global institutions it created remained, but over time their governing philosophy shifted. The religion of free trade took over, and the tariffs and capital controls were relaxed in the name of the liberalization of trade. We're getting now into what became known as the Washington Consensus. Western elites decided, a Washington Consensus, a particular specification of the ideology of neoliberalism. Western elites, says Stephanie, decided that fully exposing developing countries to global trade and to the in and out rushes of investor money would discipline their economies into becoming better. Protectionism and government intervention became dirty words. Thank you, Margaret Thatcher. The champions of this new framework insisted that free trade would eventually bring full employment and harmonious trade relations across each participating country's economy. Nothing like that has happened, of course. The IMF, WTO, and World Bank, often run by bankers and diplomats from wealthy countries, have no commitment to full employment around the world. Instead, they tend to recommend a friendly package to developing countries hit by crisis, drastic cuts to government expenditures, fiscal austerity, and along with monetary policies that were tight, very high interest rates, to raise the value of their currency and lure investors back, and of course more free trade. They also frequently recommend that the developing countries peg the value of their currency to a stronger currency like the euro, the yuan, or the US dollar. This policy mix amounts to recommending that the developing country forsake any effort to enhance the monetary sovereignty of the country. Whatever the intention, the actual results from this package are perverse when countries sacrifice their monetary sovereignty but cannot acquire sufficient foreign currency to defend the target exchange rate. Their currency pegs collapse, potentially causing a downward spiral, as governments, business, and even households cannot favorably convert domestic currency to repay debts that are denominated in a foreign currency. Hyperinflation can set in as the exchange rate plummets and the cost of crucial imports skyrockets in price. Then the recommended austerity and uh, uh, the monetary policy that's so tight crush the domestic economy, driving up unemployment and poverty, all in the name of luring in another batch of Western investors who will start the whole cycle over again. And that's not all. Historically, international organizations like the IMF have recommended that developing countries, especially those that have achieved independence from colonial powers after World War II, focus on producing and selling just a few goods to richer countries. This suggestion comes from an idea that a 19th century English economist, David Ricardo, called comparative advantage. Essentially, Ricardo recommended countries should specialize in producing whatever goods and services they are most adept and efficient at. But many influential economists take the idea of comparative advantage to extremes. For instance, they argue that developing countries should focus on what they can produce most cheaply in the short term rather than developing new industries that would enhance their monetary sovereignty over time. In other words, international Western elites have told poorer countries they should not indulge in development strategies that focus on job creation, energy independence, or any goals aside from specialized production. In effect, it's a recommendation that keeps developing countries forever developing, never achieving the kind of advanced, diversified economies of the modern West. That recommendation is the opposite of the historical path taken by the United States, Japan, and most other powerful economies. They often focused on producing crucial goods at home rather than importing them. For example, as a giant country with many diverse resources, China has developed significantly simply by increasing internal trade, as the United States did by hook or by crook for centuries. As one would expect, the Chinese government has also severely limited the role of finance, insurance, and real estate in the industrial process. Goodbye, trade war. Hello, trade peace. And this is the conclusion of Stephanie's very excellent analysis here. While MMT certainly doesn't have all the answers, it can be a useful tool in untangling the knots that all of us, the United States, the advanced West, and the developing world, are entangled in. To reform the global trade order, the U.S. must take the largest strides in making it happen. In many ways, it has the furthest to go. This doesn't mean winning or losing a trade war. It simply means recognizing what I hope this chapter has demonstrated. Trade is not about competition among countries, but about power relationships among specific interests within specific countries. Indeed, if we want a world that is safe for everyday people on the planet, we need to think a little less, I'd say much less, about trade war and start envisioning something a little more like trade peace. First off, we have to stop treating trade as something that we can beat other countries at by running a trade surplus. One country's surplus is another country's trade deficit. So by definition, not everyone can win in that way at once. But it doesn't follow that the deficit country has to sustain real economic loss if it gets its policy matrix right. The Trumpian approach to trade creates strife and a zero-sum race to the bottom over too few globally available jobs. Already, Trump's tariffs have failed to revive on the manufacturing in America. raised prices for U.S. consumers, invited retaliation from China, and contributed to a slowdown in the global economy, all in subservience to the trade deficit myth. Instead, we must recognize that the U.S. government can supply all the dollars our domestic private sector needs to reach full employment, and it can supply all the dollars the rest of the world needs to build up their reserves and protect their trade flows. Instead of using its currency hegemon status to mobilize global resources for its own narrow interests, the U.S. could lead the effort to mobilize resources for a global Green New Deal, keeping interest rates low and stable to promote global economic tranquility. Obviously, the U.S. and other advanced countries with high degrees of monetary sovereignty can run their own job guarantee programs. But what about the middle income and developing countries? Could Mexico, for instance, implement the job guarantee and end some of this human suffering? Perhaps. When it comes to direct job creation, history suggests developing countries may face fewer barriers than the international elite say they do. For example, Argentina is usually cast as a poster child of financial problems. And then she goes through the Argentinian case where, during the early 2000s, there was a massive direct job creation program that guaranteed work for poor heads of households. This program was studied and reported on by L. Randall Ray and Pavlina Cherneva in a publication called The Plan Jefes y Jefes de Hogar Desocupados, Plan for Unemployed Male and Female Heads of Households. Yeah.
I'm just getting something that says, sorry, we're having trouble playing this video, and I cannot hear you on my earphones.
Okay, let me see what's going on here. I will check and see what's going on here.
Can I bring my computer in to show you?
No, don't bother. Let me check. Okay, no, I am. Okay, I still am live, honey. I'm still live, so it must have been a local problem. Sorry, folks, I have to share the screen again. And Bonnie had a problem. I thought it was a more general problem, so I thought that I ought to check it out. I see now why the problem came up. So let me check it out now and share that. Here we go. I think that I'm sharing again. So anyway, I won't go through the HEFES program because I really need to finish this now. But by getting back to the main flow of the reasoning here, we in the United States can't run domestic policy for the rest of the world's governments. But Steph says we can run the dominant currency in a way that makes global full employment something everyone eventually could actually achieve. With decent jobs guaranteed for all, workers can engage in a public-led industrial policy aimed at producing sustainable infrastructure and a wider array of public services. Closer to home, when one considers the disparate living standards in Mexico vis-a-vis the United States, it's hard to make a case that Mexico has taken advantage of its trade relationship with the United States, as Trump has argued. Unlike China and Japan, what Mexico has done is often followed the militant neoliberal reforms proposed by the United States and the international organizations. As part of NAFTA, for example, they lowered barriers to U.S. and Canadian financial capital, and perhaps even more importantly, to our agricultural products. Although many U.S. companies picked up their manufacturing jobs and took them south of the border. The influx of U.S. farm products into Mexico, especially corn, displaced millions of rural Mexican workers, and that drove many of them across the border for jobs in the United States. This brings up to the question of so-called free trade agreements, which will need to be rethought from the ground up. So here's Stephanie arguing against the use of the free trade agreements, and especially the current agreements, including investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms. And she says correctly, these mechanisms provide corporations with a parallel system of justice that allows them to sue democratically elected governments for adopting policies, restrictions, and regulations and other protections that the corporation views as a threat to its profits, and its bottom line. Instead of handling these disputes in domestic courts, ISDS relies on private arbitration before an international body that is seen as more favorable to corporate interests. I mean, that's just blatant and patent colonization. For AIDS patients in the world's poorest countries, the patent provisions in free trade agreements like the TPP are a death sentence, says Stephanie. Such free trade agreements entrench global divisions between rich and poor. They shoehorn poor parts of the world into fossil fuel extraction, helping to hasten climate change. They give developing countries little choice but to submit to export-led growth, which in reality means exploitive labor conditions to assemble cheap goods on behalf of the wealthy and advanced countries. They even expand the monetary sovereignty of rich companies at the expense, of poorer countries. Stephanie proposes that we act as a global leader in reforming these trade arrangements. I'm certain this is what Bernie Sanders would have done if he had been successful. And of course, if he were to have won this coming November. By setting standards in the deals it helps to craft, it can demand strict ecological standards of its trading partners, as well as robust labor protections like a job guarantee geared toward helping poor nations achieve food and energy sovereignty, can insist that its trading partners share green technology and intellectual property with other countries in a way that truly lifts all boats. A revamped WTO could mandate these sorts of ideas in trade agreements as well, rather than entrenching existing privileges for powerful multinational corporations, as it does today. Meanwhile, as Bafadl Kaboub has recommended, South-South trade partnerships could help developing countries grow complementary industries and escape their position in the global production chain, where they're stuck importing high-value finished goods and exporting cheap intermediate goods. So what Stephanie is proposing here is that we radically transform our trade policies into trade policies that are truly collaborative with other nations, taking into account the developmental state, okay, of these other nations and helping them to achieve sustainability and food sovereignty and sovereignty with respect to other high valued goods, as well as currency sovereignty, helping to strengthen their currency sovereignty. Because we recognize that without currency sovereignty, we cannot really have true democracy in foreign countries, just as we can't have true democracy here as well without currency sovereignty. In theory and practice, lack of food and energy sovereignty is solvable problems. Even major food importing countries with mostly desert climates can adopt a sustainable agricultural program by investing in more water efficient hydroponic and aquaponics food production. And even countries with no oil or natural gas reserves can adopt a renewable energy program by installing solar and wind farms and investing in energy efficiency for housing and transportation. And to the extent that we encourage a global effort to contain the effects of climate change, policies that help the developing world to decarbonize their economy not only lessens their dependency on U.S. dollars to purchase fossil fuels, but also enhances global cooperative efforts to reduce harmful carbon emissions that continue to threaten our planet's long-term survival. As long as most developing countries have to import the basic necessities, they will remain developing, quote unquote, caught in a desperate scramble to acquire the currencies of the rich world. Corporations around the world will keep feverishly chasing short-term profits, extracting scarce natural resources, by polluting precious ecosystems, and ruthlessly firing desperate people, all in the name of maximizing shareholder value. Left unchecked, the situation is an open invitation for demagogues like Trump to come along, blaming foreigners and exacerbating tensions among the world's people. And Stephanie goes on. This ends soon, so I'll just read this last part of it and then go to your comments. In addition to South-South trade agreements, developing countries need to return to regulating financial transactions across borders. They may not be able to implement the classic form of capital controls that was characteristic of the Bretton Woods situation and relied on global cooperation, but they can certainly do better than they are now. Foreign investors should be limited in the ways they can invest in domestic assets and in their ability to sell out and create downward pressure on the exchange rate market. This will reduce the need to accumulate dollar reserves and help developing countries to realize the benefits that a flexible exchange rate can provide. In other words, the act of regulating international capital flows shouldn't be looked at as a short-term stopgap, but a permanent policy to help nations reach higher and higher degrees of monetary sovereignty. We share only one planet. Our current trade system is not up to the task of meeting the social and economic challenges of global poverty and joblessness. Meanwhile, we need a global all-hands-on-deck effort to deal with climate change. Trade peace isn't simply something we can achieve. It's something we can't afford but to achieve. I think, again, this is another brilliant chapter that takes things from a macroeconomic point of view and moves from start but to finish, showing how the current trade regime that obtains in the whole world and that is led by the United States, how that regime has to go, and how we need a new regime that works collaboratively, okay, in everyone's interest. And I think she has done a beautiful job, okay, at arguing towards this, at uh, in a broad way, illuminating the problems, relating this to developing nations and their problems, and the state of the developing economies, and then writing in terms of what must be done to improve this situation, and recognizing that the idea of monetary sovereignty is central to all this, that what we ought to be doing as a nation is, instead of just trying to maximize our own monetary sovereignty, which of course we should very, very much hold on to, we also need to help other countries to regain their monetary sovereignty all over the world so that they can run their own domestic policies in such a way that they can be sovereign with respect to energy necessities and food necessities and any other necessities for their own economies. So these nations can enter a community of truly independent nations that can grow together and work together and can develop together for the good, okay, of all of us. And so it seems to me what Stephanie is speaking to here in this chapter is an international public purpose, not just one overriding aspect of public purpose for the United States, but a common public purpose that all the nations of the world could have, that would help everybody to grow and to prosper. And I just have to think, okay, a little bit more about this. I have to think of how it articulates with my own vision, which I stated, okay, in my book that was also on trade. Okay, and which was entitled Who Needs the Trade Deficit? Who Needs the Budget Deficit? Or Who Cares? I forget even what I called the book now. I wrote it in 2015. And it's really a terrific book. It was even cited by Stephanie in one of the let me refresh my memory. I'm so staggered by that chapter. I wrote two books on trade. One is called The Declarations of Dependence, The Trade Tyranny, the Sovereignty, and the Democracy, which was mainly about the TPP and related the trade deals and the threat to sovereignty and democracy that they posed for the United States. But then I wrote my trade policy book, Who needs balanced trade? And who needs balanced budgets? That was the title of that book, okay, as well. And that integrated domestic fiscal policy with international trade policy and integrated them both around the idea of the public purpose of the United States. And now, having seen what Stephanie has done here, okay, I can now go further. I can think about things in terms of an integration with an international public purpose. So, what she did in that chapter really helps me in relation to further developing my own ideas. So, that's another reason why I think that this book of hers, okay, The Deficit Myth, is just a terrific book. So next time, I'm going to continue on with chapter 6, which is the entitlement by chapter. And I'll have a lot to say about that because I I really grooved, okay, on that one too. But also I'm extremely familiar with the line of thought there, okay, as well. So tomorrow I'll be covering that, okay, as well. I'm continuing this slow reading and commentary through her book because I just think it's a terrific and most important book and worth devoting this time to. Very much worth it. So let me go back now and get to your comments. Avril says, except that blogger I posted to your page, he has a problem with Dr. K's book, but I'm sure it's because of his own willful ignorance. No, it may not be. It may be that he just has some different values in mind, okay, and different objectives. It may be he doesn't care about the whole world actually developing in a mutually beneficial way. Okay, maybe he doesn't care about that. Maybe he doesn't care about sustainability. Okay, says, what a great special on Bernie's page tonight. We need another Gene Debs, laugh out loud. Well, maybe we have another Gene Debs around. In some ways, okay, I think Bernie was similar, but I don't think he had the courage, okay, or has the courage, okay, of Gene Debs. Okay, says, by the way, I suggested to Tom Hartman but today that he needs to interview Kelton. He's interviewed Stephanie before. I don't think he quite understands. I mean, perhaps if he reads this book, he'll finally really get it. But I don't think that he got it. But he's been interviewing Stephanie on and off for years now, Kay. I think he first interviewed her sometime back in 2011 or 2012. Alvarmana says the DNC is pressuring Bernie to deliver progressives to Biden votes. I'm not going. Me neither. Kay says Bernie is working for down ballot progressives. He is now. And God, we have a good chance to really add to the progressive by numbers in the House, and to add a few in the Senate also. These changes could be very, very important. Ivo says, I'd like to see him kick ass in New York just because. Me too. I'd like to see he and AOC kick ass, okay, in New York and come out with 3 or 4 or 5 new progressive Congress people, okay, in New York in this very election. Maybe Dana Balter up in Syracuse Way, okay, and Lauren Ashcraft down in the city, and Jamal Bowman, of course, in the city, okay, as well. And there's somebody else. Okay, I'm forgetting who's a great candidate down in the city. Uh, it'll come to me in a few minutes. Neville says we need a federal job guarantee paying a living wage. Isn't that going to alleviate foreign trade pressures? Yes, it will alleviate foreign trade pressures. Certainly. Okay, it will. Because people, if they're getting paid a good wage, and if our economy is booming, then they will care less about having lost some jobs. And it's not just a question of jobs. If you bring broadband to local communities all over the United States, and you bring the job guarantee to all the local communities in the United States, employing people in place, you can grow these local communities again. You can make them prosperous places. You can reignite their local cultures. You can make the people proud again. Then they won't care they lost those other jobs. They might even like the new jobs better. I'm not talking about just the federal job guarantee jobs. Remember, the federal job guarantee jobs, some of them can be structured as entrepreneurial jobs. The enterprises can be structured as cooperative enterprises that get subsidized by the job guarantee program, but that eventually go outside of the job guarantee program. The landscape of the economy in rural areas in the United States can be totally transformed by the federal job guarantee. In that case, no one will care that our trade deficit is 5% of GDP or 6% of GDP or 7% of GDP. It won't matter anymore. Of course, we'll have to spend enough so that we have a budget deficit that's greater than that. But that's all right. That's no problem. There's always work to do that can be paid for with deficit spending. So we can have a budget deficit that's greater than the trade deficit and money being put into private sector pockets. Remember, when the budget deficit is greater than the trade deficit, the private sector makes a profit. Our job is to see to it that those private sector profits fall into the hands of poor people and middle class people, and not into the hands of people who are already rich. We used to have that pattern in this country. We did. We did for years and years and years. The corporate end of the private sector did not have surpluses. Did not have surpluses. The household sector had surpluses. The corporate sector did not have surpluses. That turned That turned in, I think the first time it turned was in the 1990s that way. Another thing that happened then, okay, in the 1990s was suddenly when the Clinton administration started running its surpluses, the private sector as a whole in the United States suddenly began losing money in the aggregate, began running a deficit, a macroeconomic deficit, while private sector profits for corporations were going to all-time high. The aggregate private sector had losses. Kay says, I hope so. Very sick to death of Ohio being a shithole GOP state. We can change that. It has nothing to do with Ohio. It has to do, well, it would have something to do with Ohio then, but not the state government of Ohio. It would have to do with the federal job guarantee, and it would have to do with the actions of local communities running the federal job guarantee programs and local interests running the federal job guarantee programs. Steve says, hi, all. I had to finish my round of 8-ball. Thanks, Steve. Joanne says, hi, all. Steve DeVore says, is Kentucky voting today? I hope they kick McConnell out. I thought they were voting tomorrow. Kentucky, I hope they kick him out too. Avril says, Dear Stars, I've been following the abuses against protests in Bethel. I would have never guessed Ohio was so regressive. You would have never guessed? When was the last time they had a Democratic governor in Ohio? Avril said, wasn't that Coke or pool? Kay says, you have to be a resident here to see it. It has been this way most of my life. Pool. Steve says, my days for the other are over. That's right. Physical capacity is all it takes. If we could just get rid of the tangerine tariff sheriff. Steve says, I'm ready. Where and when? Avril says, but getting pro-TPP Joe is just as bad as tariff sheriff, if not worse. It is just as bad. We can't get pro-TPP Joe. Either he has to turn from the well, I think he just has to go. We need him to go. We really do. Avril says, oh, okay, I was just being facetious anyway. Rob says, hey, Yoda, hey, Rob. Kay says, if we get enough down ballot progressives, we will have a fighting chance. Steve says, Joe Biden, Democratic candidate, attacks Trump from the right again. Trump talks tough on Venezuela, but admires thugs and dictators like Nicolas Maduro. Well, he doesn't like Nicolas Maduro. He doesn't like him. He's trying to kill him. As president, I will stand with the Venezuelan people and for democracy. Oh, God. Biden might be worse than Trump with respect to Venezuela. Okay, I'm well done with lesser of two evils. Voting, Blackwater ops brought down Venezuela. Well, I haven't noticed that Venezuela's down yet. I see them hanging in there still. Just SMH, they're going to kill the United States off. I believe that's their plan. Once again, totally sickening how difficult it is to find a normal human being to run for president that hasn't been converted to neoliberalism or conservatism. Conservatism is neoliberalism for the most part. Kay says, Steve, we had only won twice. Bernie, DNC screwed him twice. I think he screwed himself twice. Hi, Charles Lovett. Thanks for joining, says Joanne. Avril says, invited from my other device to my friends, but of course it started acting up as soon as I sent invites, so I'm right back using my friend's device. Steve Gunzo says, Citizens United, unless there's a dispute on the corporation rules. I'm nothing democratic about it. Speaking of Adolf Twitler, No, if we have a trade surplus, it increases our ability to run fiscal deficits. Okay, remember, the budget deficit has to be larger than the trade deficit. But if the trade deficit is negative, okay, if in other words, if the trade deficit is a trade surplus, okay, let's say it's 3% on the trade surplus, then we can run a budget deficit of about 3% and still come out with a balance between the budget deficit, okay, and the trade deficit. So the trade surplus is not going to reduce our fiscal policy space, but a budget deficit will reduce our fiscal policy space. So it's okay if we have more of a trade deficit. There's no problem with that, as long as we're willing to run a budget deficit that's larger than the trade deficit. I personally think that since when we run a trade deficit, there are real benefits. Then the terms of trade are more attractive to us in real terms. So trade deficits are good for us as long as we're willing to run very large budget deficits to do things like repair our infrastructure. We have to spend $4.6 trillion to repair our infrastructure. Now, that doesn't have to be done in 1 year. It could be done in 4, 5, 6 years or something like that. But that still means what? 700 a year, 800 billion a year. Okay, that we might want to run that kind of contribution to fiscal deficit. And we can afford it, can't we? We can always afford it. If we're running a trade deficit, all the more reason why we can spend that. Avril says, I could do an FHJG today just walking around giving people ice water and fanning them to keep folks from passing out from the heat. Christ on a cracker, it's super hot already. Yeah, you could. Yeah, that's a job. No, 8 now. Kay said, laugh out loud went up again. And Joanne says, FJG, GND, and MC4A are essential to end poverty and homelessness. Absolutely. Avril says, subsidizing housing would be a cherry on top as well. Not a cherry. Subsidized housing, public housing, real housing for everyone, real homes for everyone. That's necessary. That's necessary. That's one of the economic rights. Housing is one of the economic rights. We're going to get to entitlements next time. Avril, subsidized housing would be great as long as it isn't the corporate owned. Of course, that's self-explanatory. Ending privatization of prisons would also help to end poverty. Kay says, I lived in a corporate-owned apartment building and it was a filthy mess and nickel-dime me broke. Avril says, and COVID. Lana says, Trump's simplistic trade talk is what helps his base whip themselves into a frenzy and blame Asian people. Some are not even Chinese for the job problem. And COVID, by calling it the Chinese flu, I thought he was calling it the Wuhan flu. Asian people are reported being harassed and worse. Yes, I know. We got to get rid of that xenophobic, racist, fascist. I meant to say that earlier. The tariff-tariffs policy is nothing but xenophobic fodder for his rabid, racist, bigot, toothless base. Joanne said, actually scared for the first time since COVID-19 started, although I have been quarantined for months. Arizona is blowing up due to irresponsible people and politicians. So I understand. Compared to Bush's, Clinton's, and Trump's, Nixon wasn't all that bad. Compared to Bush's, Clinton's, and Trump's, yeah, I know. Well, of course, when someone supports a burglary, okay, it's really bad. But in relation to public policy, yeah, Nixon was better. Avril says, Stephanie's writing is easy, breezy, love, and clarity. Yes, it is. She's a terrific writer. Also, the voice on Audible for her own book. Very easy to listen to. Kay says, wasn't so hot here in Northeast Ohio today, but rained and poured all morning. My roommate bought an AC unit, but since he has the main rooms of the trailer full of boxes, still he has blocked the only good place to put it. SMH, he lives in a junk pile, and that's why I live in my room mostly. Laugh out loud. Avril says, making popcorn, treating stuff, corn pop was a bad dude. Crap. Can't hear Dr. Joe munching on popcorn or his corn pop Biden slasher villain. I wasn't munching on popcorn. Fun fact, the actual official crowd count at Trump's failed Tulsa rally was only 1,578 attendees. Once you exclude paid gig actors, Trump campaign staffers, White House employees, and plainclothes, you're kidding, Steve. You're kidding. I thought it was 6,200, which was bad enough. Kay says, I heard about Fadl Kaboub last night on a Green New Deal meeting. Thought he sounded like Kelton. Well, sure. Sure, he sounds like Kelton. He studied with Kelton. He studied with Matt Forstater. He studied with Randy. They all studied together. But Kelton was Randy's student. Stephanie got into MMT very much because of Randy Ray and his efforts to expose her to MMT. Ira says, when I had money, I'd microloan through Kiva to people in some of the countries Dr. Joe just mentioned. I never took my loan repayments back. Thank you, Avril. Kay says, Greece really got screwed in that mess. Yes. You won't know how badly they got screwed. Okay, until you read my book on Greece called Austerity, Greece's Debt Crisis, and the Theft of Democracy. That was written in 2015 as well. And this book goes through a symposium held on Capitol Hill that was sponsored by Bernie Sanders and chaired by Stephanie Kelton. And that involved presentations by Jamie Galbraith, Nobel Prize winner Joe Stiglitz, and Jacob by Kierkegaard. That book was about Greece's the crisis and contains a few additional chapters that I added at the end, which give my analysis of the crisis and why Greece was not able to get out of it and why they got screwed. It's fascinating. It is fascinating. So, Avril says, what's the use in having nice things and still know others are suffering so much? I still don't own a smart TV or a TV at all for that matter. Kay says, I don't either anymore. Avril. Steve Gonza says, ditto, I don't even have a cell phone. Kay says, me neither, Steve. Flip phone here. God. Avril says, confessions of an economic hitman help me realize the cruel oppression the rest of the world is suffering due to American bullying. Yeah, the author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman has a new book out. Kay says, I just heard him today on YouTube somewhere today, Avril. I'm using my roommate's cell in exchange of washing her dinner dishes. He says, no mobile in any form here. I don't like being tracked. Avril says, love his message. It resonates internationally. How do I bypass Wi-Fi? Well, since I don't have my own place anymore, I need a mobile, but just a flip phone. Don't use it much anyway. I had a house phone till I lost my own home. Meaning, Steve, how do you surpass Wi-Fi? Kay says, I do most of my communication on my PC. I've also damned autocorrect. How do you bypass Wi-Fi? Avril says, yes, Stephanie for president of the world. Yeah, I'm wondering when she's going to run. Not so much for president of the world, but I'd be happy to have her run for president of the United States. Joanne says, living off the grid requires a minimalistic lifestyle to be successful. Seems the social benefits may outweigh the difficulties. Avril says, I like Mike Norman's proposal of independent or state currencies. Okay, I haven't seen that proposal. Okay, if you give me a link to it, I'll take a look. Hey, Joe, I like it when you highlight the text. It reduces the glare. Thank you, Steve. I'll keep that in mind. And Russ says, you're still there. I can hear you. Thanks. Avril says, Bonnie is in the house. The wind beneath the wings. Me too, Sandy says. How about global paradise, free from neoliberal oppression? Corporations equals economic death panels. Avril says, economically oppressed countries breeds terrorism. Sandy Degg says, Jane Sanders should be VP. Actually, Sandy, that's a hell of a good idea. Hell of a good idea. Jane Sanders, okay, as VP. Okay, Bernie keeps his place in the Senate, okay, at the head of the Budget Committee. And Biden fulfills his idea that he needs a woman VP. The only thing lacking is that Jane is not a woman of color. Of course, it's possible for Biden to have a woman of color who would be also quite acceptable as VP. Now, her name is Nina Turner, but I can't see Joe going for Nina Turner. But supposedly the Bidens are friends with the Sanderses. So I think Joe likes to rely on his friends. He's like that. Avril says, I mean corporate overreach. Can we still vote for Sanders? I don't want anyone else. If the primary hasn't come to your state yet, you can still vote for Bernie, yes. Jenny says, if he's on the ballot, you can, and you can write him in. Steve asks, are there any viable Native American VP candidates? I'm afraid not. Alvaro asks, if America could just get over its jingoism and realize we're all here to help those we need to help. He suspended his campaign, not ended it, right? Then he could still win. Sadie says, I voted for Bernie in the NJ primary, and I voted for Ham for Congress because Bernie endorsed him. Cool. Avril says, Bernie has retired, let him rest. And Sandy says, for the Senate, not for Congress. Avril says, Stephanie gets the big picture. Above all, she's a humanitarian. She's on the people's side. Steve says, who else? Not Biden, but definitely not Trump. Who? Not sure if he would have to re-enter to take it from Biden. I don't think he would take it from Biden. I think what would have to happen is that Biden would have to be dropping out for some reason. If Biden suddenly had a precipitous decline, cognitively speaking, then Jill Biden might then take the step of getting him to withdraw. Then Bernie maybe could unsuspend. Avril says, I don't know. So far, I'm not going to vote. Maybe write in Bernie as a protest statement will be my goal. And I may just write in Stephanie Kelton. Kelton would make a great president for the American people. I think she would. Yet, because the ETs will never come visit us if the planetary consciousness doesn't raise high enough. Kay says, I'm voting down ballot for Dems and maybe writing in Bernie. Avril says, who does the world owe? I know how you feel with all those empty votes. A vote for the incumbent, and I have a difficult time giving my vote to Trump by default. That'll kill me. I don't know what I'm going to do either. I could go Joe B. Kelton. Who knows? Maybe there's a good third-party person. I think he called it the Kung Fu flu. Or I think he called it the Kung Flu, right? At the rally, and the media called him out on it. He used Kung Flu. Yeah, I think he did. Arizona has several fires burning. Not good. Lana says, I don't watch Tom H. anymore. Despite his having Randall Ray on a few years ago, he still fear-mongers over the debt. He brings people on to talk about buying gold. I just don't like him anymore. He doesn't seem to have learned. Tom Hartman doesn't seem to have gotten it. He just doesn't seem to have gotten it. Steve says, Biden isn't vindictive like Trump, although neoliberal kills, so he'd be the silent killer. He's not so silent. He would be telling us how great everything is while he kills us. Okay, guys, I got to go. I still got a few comments to get, but okay, it's 11:23, and I have things that I must do tomorrow. Well, I don't know why Warren said that. I suppose he had his reasons. Oh, what he probably means is that we could run a larger trade deficit then without having to worry about inflation. That's correct. Yes, that's correct. If you're worried about when inflation sets in, then if we have a large trade deficit, we do have more space, because what does a trade deficit mean? It means that there's money leaking out of the private sector. So unless that money is being spent here by the foreign sector people, okay, who earned it, it's not going to cause inflation here. So I think that's what Warren meant, and I do agree if that's the line of reasoning. Lana says, I don't watch Tom H anymore. Okay, folks, I got to say good night. What's the topic for Tuesday? Oh, the topic for Tuesday is part 6, entitlements. Okay, I'm really on a trip right now to finish going over Stephanie's book. I'm sorry, I should have gone back here. Okay, thank you everybody for coming. And tomorrow it will be entitlements, and that's going to be a corker too. I'm telling you, that's a great chapter. It's a great chapter. That's just going to be a corker. Really. I'll try my best to go through 2 chapters tomorrow, but okay, Chapter 7 and 8 are the deficits that matter and building an economy for the people. I don't know that I'll be able to get through the you're entitled and get to the deficits, okay, that matter. But I mean, I'll try. I just can't promise. Everything is so good. I just can't skip it. So, if you love Stephanie Kelton, come back tomorrow. Okay, good night.